tragedy occurred when 8-year-old Sarah Lynn Paulsen was out riding her bicycle and was attacked by an unknown man at an unexpected moment. The police of Port Hatch, Indiana, could not understand who would hurt such a little angel. This man was undoubtedly the personification of evil. But whom would the investigators suspect? A deranged letter writer, a strange cook, or a genuine psychopath? Would the police be able to solve the case, considering that no one near the victim had seen any suspicious individuals and there were no witnesses? Then, clues led the police to a resident of their town who was hiding terrible secrets, and at that moment, it became clear to the officers that they were dealing with the worst maniac in Indiana's history. At first glance, the quiet Midwestern town of Port Hatch, Indiana, seems sleepy, but the residents work hard in the steel mills and look forward each year to the opening of the fair. Like every Midwestern town, the locals love anything fried and on a stick. Patty and Dan Paulsen enjoyed everything the community had to offer since childhood. The couple had 3 children and a beautiful house on Central Avenue, where they provided a wonderful environment for their little ones. Dan Paul was often away on business while Patty took care of business at the factory. On weekends, Patty and Dan took care of the household and raised their children, 13-year-old Jason, 10-year-old Daniel, and 8-year-old Sarah. An inexperienced girl, Sarah was the youngest of the 3 and loved participating in competitions. She would put on her sneakers and run off to join the boys. Sarah was ready to do anything if she could wear pink. That was her favorite color. She believed everything should be pink and almost never took off her pink plastic earrings or her pink ribbons. Her entire life was centered on the color pink. She was about to enter 2nd grade and was excited about her last day of summer vacation. It was the perfect time for her favorite pastime, collecting small creatures. She went everywhere with a jar in which she collected bugs, and besides bugs, she also caught frogs. Her favorite hunting spot was a small park across the street from the house, right next to the church, a perfect place to play. But on August 22, 1995, a terrible family tragedy took place in that little corner of paradise. Terry Swickard, a police officer in Port Hatch, had been on the force for 20 years and was prepared for anything. Even as a young man, he was interested in police work because he primarily wanted to help people. On August 22, 1995, around 12:30 p.m., Swickard's lunch break was interrupted by a serious message over the radio. A woman walking her dog had stumbled upon a dead body near a church. Terry wondered whether it was a natural death or something suspicious. 2 minutes later, when he arrived at the scene, the fire department had already cordoned off the church parking lot, and they were the ones who told Terry the terrible news. The victim was a little girl. In that moment, he thought this might be the most horrific case of his career. The sight was horrifying. A small girl lay face down on the ground wearing a swimsuit with her bottom piece pulled down her left thigh. Everything pointed to a sexual assault, but the investigators still did not know how she had been killed. While the firefighters continued to secure the crime scene, Swickard tried to identify the victim. He obtained a description of what she was wearing and her approximate age, then began searching houses in the neighborhood. A few minutes later, he was approached by Patty Paulsen, whose daughter Sarah had been out on her bicycle an hour earlier and was now missing. She said she couldn't find her daughter. Terry asked what she looked like, and when Patty described Sarah, he took her aside and said, "I believe your daughter has been found." At that moment, Patty felt the ground open beneath her. In tears, she told him that she had left Sarah that morning with her best babysitter, her older brother Jason, before going to work. It was by no means the first time this had happened, and Jason had allowed Sarah, without hesitation, to go to her favorite spot. She rode her bicycle near the church like she always did. Patty added that, when she came home from work, she didn't expect anything unusual. She had seen people near the church, but never imagined Sarah might be in danger. In an instant, the sunny, beautiful day that had started so well turned into the worst nightmare. The attack on an innocent child in broad daylight shocked everyone, and they all asked themselves who had done it and why. The Port Hatch police had to answer those questions in order to bring justice to the suffering family. Retired Captain Dave Reynolds, who had served 21 years on the force, had never dealt with serious crimes before, but whenever something terrible happened, he was the man people called. The tragedy that befell little Sarah during his shift struck Reynolds straight to the heart. He explained that he was horrified when he saw the body, as he had 2 daughters who were growing up at the time. But, he said, a true professional should be able to compartmentalize. It required all the composure one could muster to solve a murder like this. Captain Reynolds had nothing to go on. Even a thorough examination of Sarah's body yielded no leads. The police did not know how she died. There were no major injuries or bloodstains. Sarah lay with her face buried in the leaves, and Captain Reynolds suspected she had been suffocated. That was only a guess, but one thing was certain. There was a mysterious drifter in Port Hatch. It was hard to believe what had happened. No one could imagine who could have done something so horrific. Had the nightmare intruder infiltrated the town, or was it someone familiar to the locals? Sarah's mother could not believe anyone from town could be capable of such a thing. The police had to go door to door hoping to find any clue about the perpetrator. A report from neighbors pointed to a very unusual suspect. The officers heard about a man named Oliver Cranston. Oliver seemed like a nice man, but the townspeople gossiped that the local children drove him crazy. The locals knew how much he hated children. The officers wondered if the old gardener had unleashed his anger on a little girl, or if someone else was responsible for Sarah's death. Late August in Port Hatch, Indiana, is a good time for locals to cast their fishing lines and take part in the annual fishing competition with big prizes. But Chicago Tribune reporter Pam Centrum-Baum got a bigger catch: Sarah's story. She didn't just want to report about her life. She also wanted to write about how tragedies like this leave a lasting impression on everyone in the town. The Port Hatch police were worried too. They had their first suspect, but first had to wait for the autopsy results. The pathologist confirmed the family's worst fear. Sarah had been raped, and then the murderer silenced her forever. The official cause of death was strangulation, because there were no other injuries besides the marks on her neck. Sarah's killer had grabbed her by the neck and never let go. Tiny fragments of blue fabric found under her fingernails, however, indicated that she had fought for her life. Those pieces of fabric would likely help the police find the killer. The key was determining who could have done it. Yet the investigators had no concrete suspect. They could only speculate that she was murdered after she disappeared, so the killer could hide her identity. Perhaps the perpetrator did not want to be discovered, and that was the motive for murder. The investigators were not certain. Fortunately, they already had a suspect, an unsettled neighbor named Oliver Cranston. But did he fit the profile? He had no alibi. He worked alone in his garden west of the crime scene. There was gossip that Cranston didn't like children, which, of course, was not proof of his guilt, but it was enough for the police to question him. They decided to talk to him at his house. When the police arrived at Cranston's home, he was surprised but willing to talk. He was a tall man who obviously spent a lot of time outdoors. Without beating around the bush, the officers asked him if he had heard about Sarah Paulsen's murder. Cranston said he had heard of the incident but had nothing to do with it. He did admit that he had heard a child screaming in the garden that morning. Mr. Cranston said he was alarmed and realized the scream was coming from the street, not from the woods, and he recognized it was a child's scream but could neither discern the gender nor the age. Cranston thought it was just the neighborhood kids playing and went back home. The investigators were unconvinced and asked Cranston to come to the station for a lie detector test. They immediately confronted him, asking if he had killed Sarah. But he was as clear as the morning dew. The examiner found no evidence of deception, and Cranston confidently answered all the questions, insisting he had nothing to do with the case. His background appeared spotless. He had never come to the attention of the police. Since Cranston turned out to be innocent, the police had to abandon their first suspect and continue investigating new leads. Captain Reynolds needed help and knew exactly whom to contact. Bill Mess had, by that time, brought criminals to justice for 27 years, and he had no intention of stopping. His father and grandfather had been police officers in Gary, Indiana, and Bill knew from childhood that he would join the police force. When he was given the opportunity to help track down Sarah's murderer, he realized it was the right case for him. He also knew how to cope with heartbreak. He said his badge protected him like a shield, especially when confronted with nightmare cases like this. The badge helped him distance himself from reality, but this case broke through Bill's defenses and prompted him to double his efforts to find Sarah's killer. While reviewing the file, the junior sergeant had a thought. Since her body was found in the woods near the church, maybe the priest saw something unholy. The officers did not believe he had a motive, but they were looking for anything unusual nearby. They contacted Father Roderick Scott at the church, thinking he might confess something. But at first glance, this servant of God seemed like a pure angel. The priest agreed to be questioned. Naturally, he was nervous, but he recognized the importance of the investigation. The priest could not believe such a cruel act had been committed near the church, and said he would pray for Sarah and her family. The police believed Scott, but still needed to verify where he was on that fateful morning. It turned out he was in the vicinity. He was on the street and crossed the parking lot as Sarah Paulsen was leaving her house. Although Sarah was on a bicycle, the priest insisted he did not see her near the church or in the neighborhood. By the time Sarah was killed, he may already have been in God's house. Several women who worked at the church confirmed he was there, and a police check found that the priest was clean. He was removed from the list of suspects. The investigators turned their attention back to Sarah's neighbors. Since there had been a rape, they would rely on the usual method, checking the list of local sex offenders. The results were surprising. The investigators had not realized how many perverts lived in their neighborhood, and there were far more than they had expected. They knew it would take a very long time to question each person, but they planned to speak with them all in the hope of finding the one who had taken Sarah's life. Before the police could start this investigation, they received a call from the manager of a diner near the crime scene. She advised the officers to watch out for a very strange employee. She reported that Eugene Victor Britt had squirted water at other employees in the kitchen during a break, and at around 11 a.m., he had been sent home. She said Eugene had been aggressive and harassed female employees. What bothered her most was that he had left work about an hour before Sarah Paulsen's body was discovered. His punch card showed he had clocked out at 11:02 a.m. that day. What if this violent man had gone to the church and quickly disposed of the victim there? The city of Port Hatch in the state of Indiana lies on the shores of mighty Lake Michigan, which is why it is called the City on the Edge. That name took on a whole new meaning when a murderer seized control of the place. More than 2 weeks after Sarah Paulsen's death, everyone's nerves were on edge because the perpetrator was still at large. Perhaps it was a resident of the town, or perhaps just a traveler passing through. Reynolds and his team realized that the only way to calm people's fears was to find Sarah's killer at all costs. The town's residents acted as though they expected the police to solve the case soon, putting the investigators under great pressure. Fortunately, Reynolds had a suspect, the restaurant worker, Eugene Britt. It seemed it was time to pin him down. Additionally, Britt's boss had noticed something important. When she sent him home, he was headed exactly toward the place Sarah was murdered, at exactly the same time, and with a bicycle. Before the police called him in for questioning, they checked his background and discovered that Eugene was no ordinary person. He had previous convictions for rape and robbery, so the investigators had to find out more about him. After delving into Britt's past, they discovered that he had been in prison 2 years earlier for raping a 16-year-old girl. The attack on her also took place in broad daylight in a park area. This story heightened the investigators' suspicions. When they brought Britt to the station, he was visibly upset. During questioning, he was defiant, claiming the police were harassing him because of his criminal record. From the start, he tried to defend himself, but the police were not gentle and immediately asked if he had heard of Sarah Paulsen's murder. Britt said he knew nothing. But when he realized the police knew from his boss which way he had gone, he changed his statement. The man was foaming at the mouth, trying to prove that after leaving the diner, he had biked north instead of south, and thus could not have been where the murder took place. Was he telling the truth or lying? The police devised a plan. Since they strongly suspected Britt, they decided not to offer him a polygraph test. A lie detector often helps investigators in cases like this, but Eugene was such a serious suspect, and in the investigators' experience, ex-convicts are rarely willing to be tested. They decided instead to visit Eugene's sister Eva, with whom he was living, to see if she knew what her brother had been doing on the day Sarah died. But Eva was no more cooperative than her brother. Because they lacked a search warrant, the police had to leave. There was nothing linking Britt to the murder, so the investigators had to release him. They had no evidence against him. They kept investigating, trying to find something if they could. About 1,000 tips came in to the police. Everyone who knew anything called. Reynolds felt sure they would succeed, but despite the many calls, there were no witnesses and no solid leads, and the case began to stall. Patty and her husband started worrying whether the police would ever find the killer, whether they would catch him before winter. Still, they pushed aside their doubts and kept faith that the officers knew what they were doing and would find the murderer. Then Reynolds received an incredible tip. A producer at a Chicago radio station called the Port Hatch Police, informing them that Harvey Wagner had left a voicemail message claiming that he had killed a little girl from Port Hatch. The call shocked Reynolds, since people rarely confess to a murder out of the blue. But it was a serious matter that had to be followed up. Staff Sergeant Bill Marsig viewed the confession with mixed feelings, but his experience told him it was too early to celebrate. At first, you feel hopeful and relieved that the murderer has been caught, but then you realize it might be too good to be true. The caller was brazen enough to provide both his name and address. The Chicago police arrested him while Captain Reynolds drove 45 minutes to question him. Wagner held nothing back and provided important information. He confessed to Sarah Paulsen's murder, describing in detail how, where, and when it happened. The police did not know what to think, but they asked him to clarify some things. Harvey said he had taken a bus from Chicago to Port Hatch, gone into a park, seen a girl on a bicycle and killed her. However, his story did not match reality. First, he said he got off at the train station, which was strange because Port Hatch has no train station. Also, Sarah was not playing in the park that day. Despite these inconsistencies, investigators decided to pursue the matter. Wagner claimed the girl had been with two friends and that he had heard a racist remark, lost his temper, strangled her, and run away. Harvey was calm and seemed to tell the truth, but his story did not match the facts. There was something else that didn't line up. The police were certain that Sarah had been alone at the time of the murder. Wagner's statement collapsed like a house of cards, but the investigators could not simply dismiss it. He was still a suspect because he had confessed to the crime. They needed to verify his story. The police decided to test Wagner. If he were telling the truth, he would have to show them the crime scene. They brought him to Port Hatch and asked him to confirm his statements. After leading him through the town for several hours, it became obvious that he knew nothing about Sarah's death. When the officers took him to the actual crime scene, Wagner did not indicate that it looked familiar. The police realized he was a fraud. But the question remained whether he was the killer. After examining his background, they found no criminal record and released him. The investigators suspected something was off with Wagner, and they were dismayed to discover he had nothing to do with Sarah's murder. However, they could not simply ignore a man who had confessed to a murder. The next day, the police received a call from someone who was able to clarify things, Wagner's mother. She explained that her son often confessed to other people's crimes and swore he had been in Chicago on the Tuesday Sarah died. The whole episode involving Mr. Harvey dragged on for 4 days, time the investigators could have spent on something else. Of course they were annoyed, but in cases like this, you follow every lead. There was no prison cell waiting for this man, but possibly a psychiatric institution. The police resumed their search for the real killer to bring peace to the unfortunate family. No one had been arrested, and people began viewing one another with suspicion. The investigators had no new leads until they received a call from Father Scott. Shortly after being questioned about Sarah's murder, he had begun receiving strange letters from someone calling himself Mad Jack. Mad Jack sent offensive and threatening letters to the priest. Naturally, this aroused the police's attention, but the origin of the letters remained a mystery. The postmarks indicated they were mailed directly from Chicago, with no return address. Captain Reynolds and his team arrived at the church and found Father Scott aghast at the letter's content. They included 4 typed letters claiming there was no Jesus and no Santa Claus, that nothing at all existed. His words were full of rage that could have served as a motive for a crime. He seemed to hate the whole world. He also sent autopsy photos of a little girl that made even experienced investigators' hair stand on end. Clearly, something was not right with this man. The police did not know if Mad Jack was just another psychopath or the real murderer of Sarah with an unclear motive. He was obviously consumed by the Sarah Paulsen case. The officers had to find him and figure out his motives, but searching for Mad Jack proved fruitless. The police managed to identify the post office in Chicago from which the letters had been mailed, but there were no security cameras there. It was impossible to determine the sender's identity. The letters contained no names or identification, just stamps. The police had to postpone their search for Jack and hope he would have the courage to show up in person or send another letter. There was no evidence that he was guilty. Mad Jack might have been the killer, but there was nothing to support that theory. For the public, this was an unsettling truth, and for the investigators, a sobering fact. They had no luck in finding Sarah's killer. Every day, Sarah's parents hoped the murderer would be caught, but weeks and months passed without progress. The townspeople wanted answers. They kept asking the same questions. If the madman was still at large, should they let their children outside? Should they go out themselves? Just when it seemed the case would remain unsolved, new information surfaced about the man who had been on the suspect list all along. The strange man from the fast food restaurant, Eugene Britt. No one was watching him more closely than local Deputy District Attorney Brian Hansel, and he had good reason to focus on Eugene. It turned out that Britt had lied to the police during questioning. He had claimed that, after leaving work, he'd biked in the opposite direction from the crime scene, and the police had been forced to take him at his word for the time being. Then a witness emerged who stated they had seen Britt around the time of the murder on the route he claimed not to have taken. The police wondered why he would lie. That was when they received an unexpected call from Eva, Eugene's previously tight-lipped sister. This time, she had something to say. Eugene's sister played a major role in the investigation. She was very helpful, probably because she wanted to do the right thing. The investigators hoped to finally catch and charge Eugene Britt, but they had no idea that he was hiding far more evil in his past than they could have imagined. Almost 2 months had passed since Sarah Paulsen's murder when the police received new information about their old suspect, Eugene Britt. The investigators were now certain that the ex-convict had been in the area on the day of Sarah's death. He kept popping up whenever the investigators reviewed the case. Then Britt's sister called the police, saying she had kicked him out of the house because he had quit his restaurant job and was no longer helping pay the bills. She said he was now living in a rehabilitation center. With her brother absent, Eva was willing to talk, and even said she had something that might interest the police. Eva explained that while cleaning his bedroom, she had found a box containing her brother's clothes, 2 work shirts, a cap, and a pair of pants. The police immediately rushed to Eva's house, where they found the box containing Britt's work uniforms in a suspicious shade of blue. What if the tiny fibers under Sarah's fingernails came from this particular uniform? Before discovering Britt's clothes, the police had no physical evidence against him. In the first police questioning, Britt had not worn his work clothes, but now they had his uniform in their possession, and investigators were certain he was the perpetrator. Lab tests confirmed that the fabric matched the fibers under Sarah's nails. The police now had all they needed for a conviction. They didn't need to search any longer. Britt was exactly where his sister said he would be, in a rehabilitation center. When Eugene saw the police, he was dumbfounded, insisting he had nothing to do with Sarah's murder. But upon hearing about the evidence they had found, he broke down and confessed. He didn't want to talk about it in detail, only saying that he had killed the little girl in Port Hatch and that it was Sarah Paulsen. Then Britt did the unthinkable. He confessed to 9 more murders. Eugene recounted several unsolved homicides in Gary. Most of the victims had been raped as well. At that point, the investigators realized they were dealing with the worst maniac in Indiana's history. The news was shocking. Britt admitted that, over the course of 7 months, he had committed a series of murders. He bragged about his victims, 1 man and 8 women of various backgrounds and ages. He said he had hunted for victims in Gary, and only Sarah Paulsen had been found in Port Hatch. On November 2, 1995, Eugene Britt was arrested for the murder of Sarah Paulsen. He was charged with first-degree murder and rape, and sentenced to 245 years in prison plus life. The police officers were glad they had caught him. They had done everything in their power and finally succeeded in apprehending the serial killer. Their victory brought relief to the Port Hatch police, but the greatest relief was for Sarah's family. Her mother, Patty, has a unique perspective on the event. She believes that it was Sarah's destiny, that Sarah was the one who put him behind bars and ensured that justice was served. Based on Britt's confession and the evidence, investigators could guess what happened to Sarah that day. Everything started when Britt left work and crossed paths with the girl. He possibly exchanged a few words with her, then attacked. The hatred he had bottled up was unleashed. He lifted her and the bike, carried them about 20 meters, tossed the bike aside, raped and killed Sarah Paulsen. She fought desperately, but how could fragile Sarah overcome a man 3 times her size? It was the last day of summer vacation. The next day, Sarah would have been in school. Such a small detail might have completely altered her fate. People missed seeing Sarah Paulsen riding her bike everywhere, but the town's residents and her family found a way to honor the memory of the little mischief maker. Neighbors planted a tree and placed a memorial next to the church, and the nearby park was named in her honor. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.